Animation has always been sold as safe entertainment for kids, but history tells a different story. Long before edgy streaming cartoons existed, animators were sneaking in jokes, imagery, and themes that sent parents running for the phone lines to complain. Some films even carried warning labels, while others were quietly shelved for decades. So what were these so-called adults-only cartoons that rattled censors? Buckle up, because the history of American animation has a darker side than you might think. Fritz the Cat, 1972. The first cartoon to break the rules wide open. When Ralph Bakshi unleashed Fritz the Cat, it didn't just push the boundaries of animation, it crushed them. Imagine walking into a theater expecting a light-hearted cartoon, only to be greeted with wild counterculture antics, biting political commentary, and more outrageous gags than anyone thought possible in animation. That's exactly what happened in 1972, and audiences were divided straight down the middle. Based on Robert Crumb's underground comic, Fritz became a symbol of rebellion at a time when the United States was already in cultural upheaval. Civil rights protests, Vietnam, and generational clashes filled the headlines, and Fritz the Cat mirrored all of it. But instead of solemn drama, it packaged social unrest in bright, colorful drawings that were impossible to ignore. Parents weren't just concerned, many were outright horrified. Theaters that dared to show it were flooded with complaints. While some towns tried to keep it off screens entirely, critics called it everything from a work of genius to an insult to the very idea of cartoons. Yet the controversy worked in its favor. Fritz the Cat became the highest-grossing independent animated film of its time, proving there was an appetite for animation that spoke to grown-ups rather than kids. The bottom line, Fritz didn't just break a barrier, it redrew the map of what American animation could be, and censors scrambled to catch up. Heavy Traffic, 1973. If Fritz cracked the door, Heavy Traffic kicked it wide open. Ralph Bakshi wasn't done stirring the pot. A year later, he doubled down with Heavy Traffic, a gritty, surreal portrait of New York City life. This wasn't the whimsical fantasy parents thought cartoons should be. Instead, it was filled with tough neighborhoods, struggling artists, and larger-than-life characters straight out of urban folklore. What made Heavy Traffic stand out wasn't just its themes, it was the way Bakshi blended live action and animation, giving the whole movie an uneasy, dreamlike quality. The main character, Michael, navigates a world where cartoon exaggeration meets harsh reality, and the result was unlike anything audiences had seen before. Parents who had been shocked by Fritz were floored all over again. Complaints rolled in quickly. Some said it glorified bad behavior. Others accused it of being downright harmful to young viewers. The press jumped on the story. And suddenly, this little indie feature became a headline-making lightning rod for debates about freedom of expression in art. Yet despite all the protests, Heavy Traffic gained a loyal cult following. It proved Bakshi wasn't a one-hit wonder. He was committed to making animation that confronted social issues head-on. For censors, though, it was another nightmare. They couldn't neatly box it in as family fare, and that was the point. At its core, Heavy Traffic showed that cartoons could handle mature stories with honesty and grit, even if that honesty made people deeply uncomfortable. The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, 1974. When one controversy isn't enough, try 9. By 1974, audiences knew Fritz was no ordinary cartoon character, but the 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat took things to another level. Directed by Robert Taylor, this sequel leaned even harder into outrageous, over-the-top antics. The idea was simple. If people thought the first movie was too much, why not double down? And that's exactly what they did. Each life of Fritz sent him through wild adventures, poking fun at politics, war, pop culture, and everything in between. The satire was sharp, but the presentation was deliberately crude, almost daring audiences to be offended. Parents who already considered the first film outrageous were beside themselves. Complaints poured into theaters, boycotts were organized, and some places even refused to show it at all. Critics slammed it for being tasteless, while fans argued it was bold commentary wrapped in cartoon form. What made this sequel sting for censors was its timing. By the mid-70s, debates about morality in media were at a boiling point. The fact that 9 Lives seemed to revel in poking the bear only made it more controversial. In the end, the movie became infamous not for critical praise, but for pushing the boundaries of bad taste on purpose. For some, it was proof that adult animation had lost its way. For others, it was a middle finger to the establishment, daring them to look away. Either way, Fritz cemented his place as the cat parents loved to hate. Coonskin 1975, Bakshi's most explosive project. Released in 1975, Coonskin, later rebranded as Street Fight, may have caused the most heated reactions of all. On paper, it was a retelling of folk tales like Br'er Rabbit through an urban lens. In practice, it was a raw mix of satire, parody, and confrontation that audiences didn't know how to process. The film blurred the line between commentary and caricature, and that was enough to send protesters straight to theaters. Some groups were so offended they tried to block screenings entirely. Theaters that showed it sometimes reported threats, while others simply refused to book it. For Bakshi, this wasn't new territory. He'd been here before with Fritz and Heavy Traffic, but Coonskin amplified the outrage to unprecedented levels. What really set people off was the way the film mashed together familiar childhood storytelling tropes with darker imagery. Parents were appalled at the idea of tales they thought were innocent being reimagined in such a provocative way. Despite all the backlash, the film gained defenders who saw it as a fearless critique of stereotypes and society itself. Decades later, it's often reassessed as one of Bakshi's boldest works. But in 1975, all that mattered was the uproar. Coonskin wasn't just controversial, it was practically radioactive. And in the history of adults-only cartoons, it's often cited as the moment the conversation about censorship hit its peak. Mr. Bug Goes to Town, 1941. The Depression turned into a cartoon allegory. Released just before America entered World War II, Mr. Bug Goes to Town, also known as Hoppity Goes to Town, was Fleischer Studios' swan song, and it was far darker than Disney's polished fantasies. The story centers on a community of bugs struggling to survive as their humble patch of land faces destruction from careless humans. For kids expecting happy musical numbers, the undertone of eviction, poverty, and survival was jarring. The film has plenty of charm, songs, romance, and comic relief, but at its core, it was a parable about ordinary people trying to keep their homes in a world stacked against them. Critics praised its ambition, but parents weren't sure it belonged in the safe category of family entertainment. Scenes of fire, destruction, and frightened insects carried an intensity that unsettled younger viewers. Censors didn't ban the film, but its tone and timing worked against it. Released just days before Pearl Harbor, audiences had heavier worries than watching a bug allegory about eviction and despair. It flopped at the box office, sinking Fleischer's feature film ambitions. In hindsight, Mr. Bug Goes to Town looks more like an adult fable than a child's diversion. Its social commentary reflected the anxieties of Depression-era America, making it an unusual and unsettling entry in the history of animated features. Parents thought they were getting Disney-style fantasy. What they got was a hard look at survival in hard times. Gulliver's Travels, 1939, the other animated feature of the 1930s. When Fleischer Studios set out to rival Disney after Snow White, they produced Gulliver's Travels, a feature-length adaptation of Jonathan Swift's satire. On the surface, it's a colorful fantasy about the giant Gulliver washed ashore in Lilliput. But unlike Disney's family-safe approach, Fleischer's version wove in political allegory and wartime anxieties that weren't so easy to ignore. The film plays like a musical comedy at first, but Swift's source material was rooted in biting satire. Even toned down, the story of tiny kingdoms squabbling over petty disputes felt uncomfortably relevant as Europe edged toward war. For parents expecting lighthearted entertainment, the underlying seriousness was off-putting. Censors took notice too. Some foreign cuts trimmed the more obvious political parallels, while U.S. distributors sometimes reissued shortened versions closer to an hour, smoothing over darker themes. Audiences were divided. Kids enjoyed the slapstick antics of Fleischer's supporting characters, but adults were caught off guard by the film's somber tone and heavy-handed moral about conflict. Compared to Disney's lush optimism, Gulliver's Travels came across as moodier and stranger. Over time, the film developed a reputation as the too serious alternative to Disney's fairy tales. It remains fascinating today because it proves that even in the 1930s, feature-length animation could lean into commentary and provoke debate, rather than simply offering escapism. Parents didn't always like it, but Fleischer had made a statement, and censors couldn't quite decide whether to classify it as a family fantasy or an adult parable. Private Snafu Compilation Films, 1943-45. Cartoons that were never meant for kids. During World War II, Warner Brothers animators, including Chuck Jones, were enlisted to create training films for the U.S. Army. The result was Private Snafu, a bumbling soldier who embodied every mistake a recruit could make. While the shorts originally ran just a few minutes each, they were often stitched together into 30 to 40-minute reels for soldiers, creating some of the first adult animation packages ever screened. Snafu blurted out military secrets, ignored orders, or fell into avoidable traps. Each mistake was played for laughs, but the consequences were serious lessons about security, discipline, and survival. The humor was sharper, the language cruder, and the gags far bolder than anything Looney Tunes would have shown on a Saturday morning. For decades, civilians didn't see them. These films were locked away in archives, classified as government property. But once they resurfaced, parents were shocked. The idea that Bugs Bunny's creators had spent years making cartoons full of risque humor and wartime bluntness was startling. Though not commercially released in their time, the Snafu reels are a vital piece of animation history. They remind us that cartoons weren't always designed for children. Sometimes they were tools for adults to learn through laughter. And when stitched into half-hour packages, they blurred the line between entertainment and instruction, leaving behind some of the most unusual, adults-only cartoons ever made. Animal Farm, 1954. Orwell's fable brought to life and stripped of its innocence. Britain's first animated feature, Animal Farm, wasn't designed to charm children. Instead, it adapted George Orwell's grim novel about power, betrayal, and dictatorship. While Disney was filling cinemas with princesses, Alice and Bachelor gave audiences a bleak allegory where farm animals overthrow their human master, only to find themselves ruled by pigs, who are just as ruthless. Parents who took their kids. Expecting a harmless barnyard story quickly realized their mistake. The film featured battles, executions, and a dark atmosphere that made it one of the most unsettling animated films of its time. Censors allowed it through, but some countries demanded edits to soften its harsher moments. Even in Britain, critics debated whether it should be marketed as a family film at all. What made Animal Farm even more controversial was its political context. Funded in part by American interests during the Cold War, it sharpened Orwell's satire against dictatorship into a broader anti-communist parable. For adults, it was biting and timely. For children, it was nightmarish. In the years since, Animal Farm has been reassessed as a milestone of animated storytelling, one that proved cartoons could handle serious, even tragic themes. But in 1954, parents saw it as proof that not all animation belonged in the nursery. It may have been a cartoon, but its message was as heavy as any live-action drama. The Fool of the World and the Flying Ship, 1968. A fairy tale that ended up too strange for kids. Produced as a joint venture between British animators and Russia's Soyuz Multfilm, The Fool of the World and the Flying Ship was broadcast in the UK as a nearly hour-long animated film. It adapted a Russian folktale, but the surreal visuals, unusual pacing, and bizarre characters made it more unnerving than enchanting. Parents who expected a cozy fairy tale were caught off guard. The story involved grotesque helpers, eerie landscapes, and a dreamlike mood that leaned closer to experimental cinema than to family entertainment. Some children were frightened by the distorted designs, while critics debated whether it was art or just too odd for television. Censors didn't ban it, but broadcasters received complaints about it being too adult in tone. The unsettling atmosphere, combined with its cultural unfamiliarity, gave it a reputation as one of the strangest children's specials of the 1960s. Today, it's remembered as a cult piece of British animation history, notable for how far it strayed from traditional storytelling. For families in 1968, though, it was more nightmare than bedtime story. Yellow Submarine 1968, a psychedelic revolution disguised as a cartoon. When the Beatles lent their names and music to Yellow Submarine, many assumed it would be just another fun pop music tie-in. What they got instead was one of the strangest, most visually daring animated films of the 1960s. Its story about the Fab Four rescuing Pepperland from the sinister blue meanies was really just an excuse for an explosion of color, surreal imagery, and counterculture spirit. Parents didn't know what to make of it. On the surface, it seemed playful, with quirky characters and Beatles songs. But beneath that surface, it was drenched in psychedelic visuals and experimental animation styles that critics described as mind-expanding. Some worried it was too weird, too suggestive, or too intense for kids. Censors didn't cut the film, but they didn't know how to classify it either. Was it a children's adventure or a psychedelic art film for grown-ups? In practice, it became both. Teenagers and young adults embraced it as part of the late 60s counterculture movement, while confused parents wondered if their children should even be watching it. Over time, Yellow Submarine gained classic status, not just as a Beatles film, but as proof that animation could break free from traditional storytelling. It wasn't about talking animals or fairy tales, it was about style, imagination, and a sense of cultural rebellion. For kids in 1968, it was mesmerizing. For adults, it was baffling. For censors, it was simply unclassifiable. The Snowman, 1969. A winter tale that wasn't so cozy. Long before the gentle 1982 classic, Hollis and Batchelor produced a very different snowman for British television in 1969. This half-hour animated film was billed as a seasonal special, but what viewers got was something much darker and more unsettling. Instead of celebrating holiday joy, the film leaned into atmosphere, mood, and melancholy. A lonely boy builds a snowman, but rather than coming to life as a friendly companion, the creation becomes a symbol of fragility, isolation, and loss. The backgrounds were stark, the pacing slow, and the story carried a haunting stillness that left children unnerved. Parents who tuned in expecting something cheerful were startled to find a ghost story tone creeping into what should have been a festive broadcast. Critics praised the artistry, noting its moody visuals and bold decision to treat animation as emotional storytelling rather than simple entertainment. But the controversy came from the mismatch between expectation and delivery. Families wanted warmth, instead they were given sorrow. Some censors even suggested moving it away from prime family slots, worried that its tone was too bleak for younger audiences. Over time, The Snowman of 1969 faded into obscurity, overshadowed by the more famous 1982 version. Yet it remains a fascinating example of how British animation in the late 60s wasn't afraid to experiment. For children, it was confusing. For parents, it was jarringly sad. And for historians, it proved once again that not all cartoons were meant to comfort. A Christmas Carol, 1971, the most haunting Christmas cartoon ever made. While most animated holiday specials are warm and cozy, Richard Williams' A Christmas Carol was something else entirely. Premiering on British television in 1971, this 30-minute adaptation of Dickens's story leaned hard into eerie atmosphere, chilling ghosts, and visuals inspired by Victorian engravings. Williams, who would later win fame directing Who Framed Roger Rabbit, wasn't interested in a soft family version. His Scrooge wandered through shadowy streets, haunted by ghosts that were anything but friendly. Jacob Marley's apparition, drawn with glowing chains and hollow eyes, was enough to send children running from the TV. Even the ghost of Christmas yet to come was rendered like a figure from a nightmare, draped in darkness. Parents were startled. Many complained it was far too frightening for children, and some broadcasters hesitated to re-air it during family programming hours. Yet critics praised its artistry, and in 1972, it won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Subject, despite being half an hour long. The controversy lay in its tone. Instead of wrapping Dickens' morality tale in festive warmth, Williams presented it as gothic horror with a hopeful ending. For adults, it was a striking reminder of Dickens' darker intentions. For kids, it was traumatic holiday viewing. Today, A Christmas Carol remains one of the most respected animated adaptations of Dickens' work. But in 1971, it stood out as a reminder that even a seasonal cartoon could cross into territory more suited for adults than children. The Tales of Beatrix Potter, 1971. Not the bedtime story parents expected. In 1971, British television aired The Tales of Beatrix Potter, an unusual animated and live-action hybrid that pushed far beyond cozy storytelling. While the characters, Peter Rabbit, Jemima Puddle Duck, and others, were beloved children's icons, the adaptation leaned heavily into surreal staging, dark shadows, and unnerving close-ups. Instead of gentle moral lessons, viewers were given a haunting mix of ballet-like movement, dramatic music, and unsettling costumed figures. Parents who tuned in expecting a sweet, harmless half-hour were shocked. Some children were frightened by the exaggerated animal designs, which looked more like masked apparitions than playful characters. Critics praised the artistry, but admitted it carried an eerie quality that made it unsuitable for very young viewers. Censors didn't ban it, but broadcasters noted the complaints and began airing it in later time slots. Over time, the Tales of Beatrix Potter has gained cult status among animation and performance historians. Its ambition was undeniable, blending traditional storytelling with avant-garde presentation. But in 1971, families didn't see it that way. For kids, it was confusing and eerie. For parents, it was a reminder that even the most innocent stories could turn into something unsettling once animation, or in this case, experimental staging, pushed past its boundaries. 1001 Nights compilation 1940s to 50, cartoons stitched into something stranger. During the 1940s and 50s, UPA revolutionized American animation with its minimalist designs and biting satire. While Disney offered rounded fairy tales, UPA gave the world angular characters, modernist visuals, and stories aimed at grown-ups. But when Columbia Pictures stitched several of these shorts into a 40-minute theatrical 1001 Nights package, audiences didn't know what to think. The compilation pulled together shorts in a loose anthology format, framed like exotic tales. On their own, cartoons like The Unicorn in the Garden or The Magic Fluke carried sophisticated humor that adults appreciated, but kids found them strange, talk-heavy, and even unsettling. Parents complained that the satire was incomprehensible to children, while critics praised the artistry but questioned the marketing. Censors didn't cut the reels, but theaters often advertised them cautiously, unsure whether to sell them as family fare or adult novelties. In some towns, the reels were quietly dropped after parents walked out mid-show, unhappy that their children were fidgeting through a cartoon about conformity and existential angst. For UPA, the controversy was a backhanded compliment. They weren't trying to copy Disney. They wanted to prove animation could handle themes like consumerism, bureaucracy, and morality. In stitched-together form, though, the shorts felt even more surreal, baffling mainstream audiences. Today, these compilations are remembered as bold experiments that broaden the definition of what a cartoon could be. In the 1940s and 50s, however, they were just another reminder that not every animated reel was meant for children. The Plague Dogs, 1970. The cartoon too bleak for family viewing. Long before its full release in 1982, The Plague Dogs began as a grim animated project in Britain during the early 1970s. Based on Richard Adams' novel, the story followed two dogs escaping from a research facility only to face starvation, cruelty, and hopeless wandering across the countryside. Early reels and shortened test edits were screened in art house settings and on television, enough to spark outrage. Parents who saw the test footage were horrified. This wasn't Disney's Lady and the Tramp. It was a bleak tale of suffering animals, rendered with unflinching honesty. Children who watched the screenings were reportedly reduced to tears, and broadcasters quickly realized it was unsuitable for family audiences. Censors didn't outright ban it, but they strongly advised against daytime or general screenings. Critics were divided. Some hailed the project's ambition, praising its willingness to tackle animal cruelty and moral questions. Others argued that its despairing tone made it unwatchable, especially in animated form. The controversy almost derailed the production entirely, with financiers unsure if anyone wanted to see such a grim animated film. Though the full-length feature wouldn't be completed until the early 80s, Those early reels cemented the Plague Dogs as one of the darkest experiments in British animation. For adults, it was harrowing. For kids, it was unbearable. And for censors, it was one more example of how far animation could stray from safe family fare. So there you have it. 15 cartoons that proved animation was never just child's play. From Bakshi's gritty New York features to Britain's surreal experiments, these films rattled parents, baffled censors, and showed that cartoons could unsettle as much as they could amuse. Which one shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts below, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe. Animation's hidden history has plenty more secrets waiting to be uncovered.